This is Office Hours.
The show for sharing experiences and stories in governance, risk management, and compliance.
Hello, Newman.
Hello, Jerry. Hey, this yogurt is really something, huh? And it's non-fat. I've been waiting for something like this my whole life, and it's finally here.
I love Seinfeld. Just makes me miss New York.
Well, Dan, today we're going to talk about the risk of too good to be true. And I was never a big Seinfeld fan myself.
What's wrong with you?
I know I'm a little bit weird. But I did remember the episode of the non-fat yogurt. For some reason that stuck out in my mind. And so I thought it was a perfect example of the yogurt industry in that Seinfeld, or that yogurt company in Seinfeld, making all that money off yogurt, non-fat yogurt, when in fact it was full of fat.
What made you think of that, Kev?
Good question, Dan. A couple days ago, actually saw this in the news where Nissan admitted to cheating on some emission tests. And what actually happened is a few years ago, they got caught cheating and got some fines from the government. And so their audit team decided to do a full compliance audit across the board of all their manufacturing plants to ensure that they were following proper regulations. And what they ended up finding is that their emission tests, particularly for cars in the Japanese market, the data was being altered by some employees so that they could pass the emission tests for Japan.
That story sounds somewhat familiar.
It does sound somewhat familiar. There was another car company who had a similar problem, and that was Volkswagen. So when I saw this Nissan article a couple days ago in the news, it instantly made me think of the Volkswagen scandal.
You know what else it reminds me of too is I think about a few customers we've worked with from a risk perspective, particularly in big industrials or big tech, those kinds of companies. Another good example of, sometimes things seem too good to be true. You've won some substantial, outstanding government contracts in strange places around the world that are celebrated as these big revenue wins. But what is that? I mean, it's clearly an indication of maybe from a risk management perspective, we got to think about what led up to achieving that great outcome, and is there anything related to, say, the FCPA that might have led bribery issues or that might have led to that great outcome?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack a little bit today. We're going to talk about what was Volkswagen actually trying to do? What problems were they trying to solve? What ended up happening? And then we're going to talk a little bit about maybe I did pull some data and take a look at some data that I pulled to see if there were some indications that something might have been a little bit
amiss. And hindsight's always 20/20, right? But I think it's an interesting way to think about risk indicators is risk is always the flip side of opportunity. So where big material opportunities have emerged, probably a good time to be thinking about what's the big material risk on the flip side.
Yeah, exactly. And full disclaimer that we don't know any of the inside information.
We have no shared experience in emissions issues.
Yeah, and we have no inside information on what actually happened. We just thought it would be a good discussion point for today's topic. And so actually Volkswagen was back in the news a couple weeks ago. They got fined by Europe for the same scandal that went on. Mm-hmm. So I think around $4 or $5 billion currently in fines.
In hard fines.
In hard fines.
CEO lost his job, though.
CEO lost his job. The reputational risk, which we'll see from some of the data in their stock price and stuff. So pretty big impact to the company, this scandal. Whereas Nissan, their audit team came in, thought there was a problem. They actually ended up finding something. They had to recall a bunch of cars, obviously, which is going to cost a bunch of money, but nowhere near the impact of the scandal when somebody else finds the problem.
So another inherent lesson is when something goes wrong at a company like you, it might be a good moment in time to consider how exposed you are to that risk as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I actually want to step back a little bit. I don't know if you saw the Netflix special where they've dug into the Volkswagen scandal, but it's actually really good. But I'm just going to talk a little bit at a high level. If you want more detail, you can watch that. But essentially what happened is in the mid-2000s, Volkswagen had this goal of becoming the largest car manufacturer in the world. I think at the time they were sitting maybe fourth or fifth. And the big opportunity for them was they were really dominant in Europe. But in Europe, the car manufacturing industry is a little bit different. It was about 50% diesel cars sold in Europe at the time.
Right.
And in the US, it was only 0.5%. So what Volkswagen thought is, hey, to become the biggest car manufacturer in the world, the US is the second largest market in the world for buying cars. If we could turn that 0.5% market into something material for diesel cars, we could have a really big impact. And there's not a lot of competition there. So that's what Volkswagen was setting out to do in the mid-2000s. And then so they end up diverting a bunch of engineering resources to go basically build a new diesel car for the US market.
Right.
The problem is then the US regulators come along and they change the rules of the game on Volkswagen while they're in the middle of this kind of long-term strategic goal. And you'll see here in this slide the difference between US and European emission laws, where for nitrogen oxides, which is the major pollutant that comes out of diesel engines, the emission thresholds for the US are about half what they are for Europe. And for carbon monoxide, which is the major pollutant that comes out of regular gasoline cars, it's quite different, where in the US, it's almost 3 times the amount that it needs to be for Europe. So very big difference here. And there are some diesel cars in the US that are able to meet these compliance requirements. And they use this technology that essentially traps the nitrous oxide, treats it, and changes it before it goes out into the air. However, that technology is very expensive, and Volkswagen, because they have the Jetta, they're kind of a lower end car, and they wanted to attack that low end car market, and they decided to not implement that technology in the Jetta so that they could have an entry level diesel car. In order to, they really thought that was key to their strategic goal of penetrating the diesel market in the United States. So they decided to, and I won't go too deep into this, they decided to take a different route with technology. And my understanding from reading some of the court documents is that they thought they had a really good strategy in place, and then they weren't able to overcome the engineering side of it. So what they ended up doing is they ended up writing software code into the cars in order to cheat the tests in a testing environment. And then that code would turn off the emission regulations in the engine when it was on an actual road. And so the nitrous oxide wasn't getting treated at all, and it was emitting about 20 to 40 times the allowable amount, which is an awful lot. But suffice to say, basically what happened there is they thought they had a really good strategy. They weren't able to overcome the engineering, and they didn't. In order to accomplish their strategy, they didn't think they could afford to pay for the technology that was currently out there, and so they decided to take a different route, which was cheating. So I just think really interesting to look at some of the historical data around Volkswagen. If you look at it, in 2009 was actually when they released their clean diesel Jetta in the US, and then after there, the amount of cars they were manufacturing really started to take off. So their strategy was solid, and they ended up executing on it quite well, even though they weren't playing totally by the rules. And then if you look at their stock price, so that paints a little bit better of a picture, but if you look at their stock price, same story. They really dipped leading up to 2009. And this was largely because they didn't release any 2007 or 2008 model in the US because they weren't able to meet the compliance requirements. And then they were able to recover from that when they released their new clean diesel model. And obviously leading up to 2015, and then the scandal comes out, and their CEO gets fired, the scandal hits the news, and obviously their stock price takes a massive hit.
An enormous problem, without a doubt. But I think what's interesting is there's obviously a good trajectory again. So perhaps from a risk management perspective, it seems there's avoiding a situation like this in the first place certainly important, but clearly resiliency as part of your risk management program is equally important, because bad things happen to every organization, right? And it's also interesting because a number of large companies have had security breaches over the last few years and didn't see nearly that drop off in their stock price that Volkswagen did. And I think that might be an indication of that. There was a better resiliency plan around how do we react to a security event that didn't get prevented than there is a resiliency plan for we have this sort of ethical issue emerge.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is the risk management team maybe had a program in place for a better response to this type of event happening. Potentially they could have had better resilience.
Yeah, a more clear outcome, right? Oh, in the event of a breach, we do X, buy credit monitoring for all the people whose personal data was breached. Da 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 da.
Right.
But similarly, a lot of times when we think about business continuity plans, how does the business react in the event of a disaster that makes it difficult for us to operate? But you don't often have a resiliency plan or a continuity plan for what happens if a reputational scandal erupts.
Right. And if you're every industry is going to have some type of risk like that. So ensuring that you're addressing it and thinking about it and having a plan can really...
Interesting to think about in the context of business continuity resiliency. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So being a data guy, I thought it would be interesting to go and see if there was any data out there that I could look at to see what it said.
Right.
Essentially what I was trying to do is look at, I think I read some articles where there were some leading indicators that maybe looked like there was something going on with Volkswagen. Mm-hmm. Like they had been caught of some things in the past. And then also a lot of their competitors were noted as saying in like around 2010, 2011, applauding Volkswagen for this engineering feat that they were able to accomplish without using the technology that was out there. But some of them were even suggesting that, that technology didn't actually exist. So there were some other leading indicators there. But being a data person, I wanted to go see what data was out there that maybe could have pointed somebody in the direction of saying, I want to learn a little bit more around how we're solving this problem.
Sure.
So I'm just going to flip over to some simple data analysis I did for this problem. So here I have a really simple data set on some emission testing for various diesel cars in the US. You can get similar data for other regions like Europe and whatever.
So this is public. You were able to pull this is real data about real cars that anybody can pull.
Yeah, actually the regulators make all their testing data public and transparent. At least in the US and Europe, I was able to find that. I didn't look for other regions. But we'll post the link below in case anyone is interested in getting it. And it's very detailed testing information, like it even has the weight of the cars, the horsepower, the torque of the engines.
That's one of the super powerful things, though, right? It's in sort of risk-oriented functions, we're always running around internally begging for access to data. But there's nothing better than an external third-party validating sort of set of data, right?
Yeah, I think you could even do some interesting competitive analysis if I was a car manufacturer here to see what the tests are like coming out on my competitors. But for today, I wanted to see whether there was anything interesting in the data. This data is from 2015, so from before the scandal broke out. Mm-hmm. And I picked some essentially filtered for diesel cars in the US and picked some cars that an article I read said were competing with each other, although they were in different classes. Obviously, the Audi A7 is in a different price point than the Volkswagen Jetta. But the two cars that everybody in 2015 thought were in direct competition with each other was the Chevrolet Cruze and the Volkswagen Jetta, who who are both around the same price point, both around the same performance, and both diesel cars in the US. And so along the bottom here, we have nitrous oxide emissions amounts from the tests. And here on the left, we just have fuel efficiency, so miles per gallon. So the idea in diesel is there's a big trade-off between how you treat your emissions, the amount of fuel economy and performance that you get out of your car. There's a big trade-off with when you lower the emissions, you don't get as good performance or fuel economy.
Right.
And so over here, we have the Chevy Cruze, which is sitting over here below the 0.04 NOx levels. And then over here on the left, we have the Volkswagen Jetta. And what I think is interesting about this data set is, I mean, the Grand Cherokee seems to be performing pretty well, but there's an obvious cluster of data points here for diesel cars and their nitrous oxide output. And then the Jetta is almost twice as good as all of those, while maintaining the best miles per gallon on the market and at the lowest price point. So to me, this is data to say, hey, this looks too good to be true. It might not be, but that would lead me to maybe question and dig a little bit deeper into what's going on.
So again, we have no idea what happened at Nissan, but good chance that somebody, you said it was audit that found it, or that this.
They did a round of compliance audits.
Yeah.
That was the only information I was able to find.
And perhaps it was some kind of exercise like this that said,
yeah, some of these numbers seem a little bit too good to be true.
Right.
Maybe we should go make sure that the data that we're providing is accurate.
Interesting. Now, say you had seen that. I suppose the next question is, that's interesting, but what the hell do you do with that if you're in risk management, internal audit, quality compliance, etc.?
Yeah, so the question that I have for you, Dan, being an ex-auditor and someone who is in risk management, is I put myself in these auditors' shoes and I think about, okay, I find this big problem where we're cheating on these tests in order to pass the compliance, in order to pass the compliance test, basically. And I find this big problem that's related directly to the strategy of the business. How hard is that going to be to bring that up, or what does that feel like as an auditor, and how should people think about it and react to those kinds of things?
So I've never been in one like that. That's an interesting question, because it's like, as an auditor in this particular case, I just have questions. I'm not especially competent, and it's not like I'm some kind of engineering expert in nitrogen oxide emissions.
That's the other thing, is like audit is expected to become an expert in every area of the business.
In everything, yeah. So that's a challenge. I can tell you, though, I was involved. Phil actually asked me about it on a previous episode where he asked, have you ever found something you could get fired for? I did run into an incident where a mutual fund company, an asset management company, had an investment officer, and investment officers tend to be like equally important to the CEO in those kinds of companies, right? Where it was found that person was abusing company funds to take personal trips and golf trips to Mexico and this sort of a thing. And in that particular case, we were I was with a professional services firm, so I wasn't an actual employee, but the chief audit executive there indeed did disclose it, which I thought was valiant, but did have to do it directly to the audit committee rather than through the standard escalation of of audit findings, as it were. And so I've worked with a number of customers for similar reasons to that. Will have for example, their ethics hotlines and their ethics submission forms and that sort of thing go directly to the head of audit, or if they have one that is a fraud submission sort of thing that may even go to an audit committee member. Right,
to ensure that those things don't get swept under the rug by the wrong people.
Right. And so similarly, we worked with a government. There's a national government we work with where they did where the oversight, one of the oversight bodies, the general auditors within that government found issues where crime statistics were being misreported by the police, effectively trying to make crime look better than it actually is. And when they began to attempt to report it, it became, oh, well, the head of police was a political appointee by a certain cabinet member. Therefore, as it got escalated, it only wanted to get swept under the rug more. And even as it escalates, there's no one in a chain of political appointees that wants either a corruption issue like this to surface, nor do they want crime to look worse on their watch. And so that actually had to be disclosed to the press and to the public.
Because that makes them all look bad in that case if
that's exactly
that gets
right.
out. Yeah.
Hard decision to make.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the only relatable example that I can think of from my experience back in consulting days is that I did work with a company who their chief audit executive was he really wanted to build his internal brand with other executives in management. And so I know he didn't want to find anything purposely about executives or any other managers or departments. And so he purposely excluded from any of his tasks and any of his audits any transactions from the executive teams, which kind of felt weird at the time, helping consults for something like that. But I can understand his position, right? It's a tough position to be put into when if you do find something, he's going to feel obligated to raise it. And so I think he just wanted to not find something so he didn't have to be put in that position.
That's what we're all here for, GRC professionals, to save the world, though. So don't love that position like the one this other CAE took better in my case.
Yeah, but if you look back at it, if you the Nissan audit team or compliance team, whoever it was, actually ended up saving the company from much worse results. I don't know if they learned from some of their competitors or not. But good on them for going to do those audits and actually raising something that big up to the chain of command.
And reminder that self-reporting is always much better than self-reporting to the regulator. Turns out much better than the big surprise.
Yeah, they didn't get any big fines. They basically just had to recall some cars and fix some of the issues that were going on.
So the lesson from today: too good to be true. Perhaps consider it from a risk assessment perspective.
Yeah, I think that's the lesson for today. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked the episode, subscribe and like and give us some comments and feedback. Until next time.
Thanks so much.